Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I'd like to tell you a story about Bible translation and bad theology, using one of the most familiar verses in all of the Old Testament, and how it's used so badly, and how if we are honest about the way that it should be used, then maybe we can understand it in a different way. So I'll start by we're talking about Jeremiah 17:9 in particular, and this reads, "The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it?" And this verse is used really often, especially by sort of hardcore Calvinists and people who are fundamentalists, people like the Desiring God crowd, John Piper. And I'd like to go through how this verse has, and especially the verse after it, 17:10, are translated, and how that translation really matters. Because a bad translation, or maybe a translation that's hard for understand the Hebrew idiom, has caused a bad theology that we live with, that we suffer with. So many people suffer with this verse. So I'll do that. I'll talk about the Hebrew words, how they were translated in different ways and for different reasons, and then how people like the Desiring God people have used it in a bad way, and what it really means, and how we can have a better, more wholesome look at these verses. And I think really about the whole Bible and how we approach the heart and how we use the heart in decision making. You know, head and heart in our world is a duality that we think is absolute and was true forever, and it really wasn't. So let's get started. Like I mentioned, Jeremiah 17:9 is, "The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it?" And if we keep going to the next one, next verse, it says, "I, the Lord, test the mind and search the heart to give to all according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings." Sounds pretty straightforward. Sounds like something that we should apply to our lives. It's unlike some scripture where you kind of go, well, does that really apply to me? Or is that really only talking about the ancient people? This is one that can be useful advice for a modern audience, for us. But it's not what you think it is, or at least what many people think it is. And that is, we think of it, and it's been used very often in this heart mind duality that we have, in that we think that the heart is the seat of emotion, passion. It's the feminine, and some misogynistic people think of it as sort of like the feminine, it's irrational, and it's the head, cool, calculating, rational, and that's what we should trust. We should trust the head and not trust the heart. Well, they've got it completely wrong, and it was completely wrong in Hebrew because the Hebrew is quite different. So let's go into a little bit about what those Hebrew words are. The word for heart is lavav, and lavav in Hebrew times, or in times that Jeremiah was written, meant the seat of emotion, or a seat of reason and thinking. They had a strong belief that the heart had cognitive abilities, and that's where your smarts came from, was from the heart. Now you go, well, that seems really silly. I mean, obviously it's the brain. Well, no, they didn't think that. Part of the reason why they did that is because the heart is exquisitely tuned to the way we feel, right? Our heart rate goes up and down. We can feel it pumping out of our chest. We can feel like when it's quiet. And even today, that metaphor for having this organ in the middle of our bodies be the central part of our bodies makes so much sense. We kind of feel like we're thinking from the heart, or dealing from the heart, is the central core of our being. So we've retained that metaphor for ourselves, even though we know that the heart organ has no cognitive abilities, even though it kind of seems like it should, right? It's an easy thing to understand. They thought in Hebrew that, however, that was where rationality happened. That's where your thoughts, your cool calculations, and your thinking happened in the heart. And they think that they didn't really think of emotions as much about thinking. They thought emotions was more visceral. So actually, they thought that the kilayot, wa which are the kidneys, is where passions came from, where the seed of passion, emotion, sort of like they even thought that way too. Is the heart was a stern heart, was a masculine thing, and that the emotions, the kidneys, were a feminine thing. They were misogynistic about this too. But that that's really important, right? Because whenever we see the word heart or lavav in the Old Testament, then we think, ah, no, that's really, it's not. Now, of course, they thought that you thought, sadness and other emotions like that, but they didn't think the passion came from the heart. That came from the kidneys. So, but they also thought everything else came from the heart as well. So whenever you see in the Old Testament, you see the word heart or something from the heart, that it's really a combination. It is that rational, cool calculation. It's also really just thinking, just the mind. So one way that you see this, because in Greek they didn't have that feeling, that cardia, the heart, wasn't necessarily uh, the same as Hebrew thinking. Jesus actually thought or dealt with this in when he was talking about the Shema prayer. Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. He added the word in Matthew, he added the word mind because heart in Greek in that time was not sufficient to describe what goes on in your cognitive thinking, right? In your thinking. So he added mind because at that time they understood that there was kind of like the rational mind, irrational mind, unlike the Hebrews, which just thought of thinking being in the heart. So that's why they added the mind. So here we are today. This is all very confusing because we keep the metaphor of the heart being that soft, compassionate, empathetic, but also passionate, emotional. You feel sadness or jubilation out of the heart, right? But we also know that the cognitive stuff is happening in the brain, and that the heart just is a response to that, right, or a metaphor for that. So we retain that. The kidneys, we don't think about that. But uh, so what are we supposed to do with these verses? So when we look at Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is devious above all else. What it is perverse, and what can understand it? Who can understand it? Right there, they're talking about the mind. They're not talking about the seat of passion. They're talking about the mind being fooled. In the context of these verses and throughout Jeremiah, Jeremiah is talking about the Israelites, the Judeans, the people in Jerusalem toward the end of their uh, existence, essentially before the exile. King Josiah Jeremiah is from King Josiah through King Zedekiah, and then the exile. So they were constantly dealing with the Babylonians and the threat of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. So here they are, um, and he's making a commentary on Judah and saying, "Y- it's it's your cool calculation. It's your political machinations. It's your overthinking that's getting you in trouble. The heart is devious above all else. I would say your political calculations and your seeking advantage in that way without God, without understanding, without compassion, without empathy is devious above all else. That's what was really meant in this verse. And in fact, if Judah had been more attuned with her heart, as we think of it, more in tune with the compassion for the people, more in tune with the idea of following God, having righteousness for God, doing the right thing no matter what, then they wouldn't have provoked the Babylonians into coming and destroying Jerusalem. That was the idea that Jeremiah was warning people. That's why he was crying so much. He was saying, listen to it, not only listen to reason, but stop your playing the Egyptians and the Babylonians off of each other and just be faithful. Because being faithful is being true to the heart in that thinking. So, you know, being true to the emotions actually in that thinking, being true. And the reason why you can kind of see this in the next verse, because they say, or in the NRSV, it says, I, the Lord, test the mind. That actually, the word there for mind is actually lavav, heart in Hebrew. But I test the heart and I search the heart, which is actually kilayot, which is the kidneys. Um, and I use, and or I should say, they test the test the kidneys and search the heart. It's confusing, even to me. But the idea is that you can see that there is this duality in Hebrew here. So it's kind of like the mind needs to be tested by the heart or countered or needs to be uh, um, checked by the our mind. The rationality needs to be checked by feelings. That's really what the meaning of this verse is. Now there's a couple of the reason why it's so easy to confuse is because they actually flip the words when you look at it in Hebrew and they flip the position. So the ESV keeps the position. It says, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind. And that keeps the position of it. The NRSV actually flips the position, says, I test the mind and search the heart. And they switch the words too. So there's a version of the Bible that's very literal called the Jubilee Bible. It's very literal in Hebrew. It says, I, the Lord, search the heart and try the kidneys. Because that's really what it says. That's like a word for word of the Hebrew. But the reason why that's not very useful to you and me is unless you are a biblical studies person, understand the role of the kidneys in Hebrew, then you're just going to go, wait a minute, okay, you're searching my heart, I get that, but then you're going to try my kidneys. What you're going to, give me pain in the kidneys, a kidney stone? It doesn't make any sense to us, but uh, it really kind of gets confusing here. So there is a translation, and there are a lot of them that kind of get a little bit closer. The one I like is the NET on this verse. The New English translation says, I, the Lord, probe into people's minds and examine people's hearts. I deal with each person according to how he has behaved. I give them what they deserve based on what they have done. Now, that to me is much more clear. Again, they flip the words because I, the Lord, probe into people's lavav. That would be the way it is in Hebrew. But the NET uses the word minds, lavav. So they actually use the more of the Hebrew understanding of lavav, and that is that the rationality. And then it says, I will examine people's hearts, which is really the kidneys, the kilayot. And so the meaning of the verse is, I will, test, or I will, I will examine, search how you're thinking, and then I will search, or then I will examine it based on what your um, rationality, your emotions are, or not irrationality. I'll test your rationality by your emotions. And this is very useful for us, right? Because anybody who's been in a major decision making role, suppose you've been a manager, a leader, a politician, or a pastor, for example, you know that all good decisions are a combination of cold hard facts, data, and a gut feel, or uh, an impact, compassion. Like, so for example, the best business decision might be to do XYZ, but then you always have to measure, okay, how are people going to respond to it? Is it going to hurt people? How is it going to how is it compared to the mission of the organization? See, that's good decision making. Anybody who's been in that role understands that you have to do this balance. And that's what Jeremiah 17:10 is saying. He said, yeah, make a rational, do something rational, but you have to examine, I will examine, he says, people's hearts, or meaning the kidneys in Hebrew. And so I explained this in a sermon recently, and it was kind of hard to go through it. I had to just go through it piece by piece by piece. People got it, but you just wow. And why is this so important? Why is it? Does it really matter that you really parse these couple of verses? Well, the reason why is because it's been used terribly. This idea of that the heart is devious above all else. This verse has been used a lot, especially by Calvinists, and not just Calvinists, but really anybody who is trying to avoid or believe that being soft-hearted or compassionate or doing the irrational thing for the benefit of people, being empathetic is weak, and you shouldn't do it. And you got to be cool, calculating, hard-nosed. You have to, you don't realize that being cool, calculating, hard-nosed is also being hard-hearted. Instead of taking your data and measuring it against how it impacts people, it's just doing it anyway. You see this a lot in our current environment, where lots of federal employees are being fired, right? When I was in business, I saw this a lot too. Is that sometimes the new guy would come in, the new CEO would come in, and just mass fire everybody. And that was partly done to traumatize people. That was done to traumatize people. That's what's happening right now. It's to traumatize people. It's very destructive. And you kind of go, well, okay, well, is that good business or not? Now, this is one of those cases of, if just with maybe it may be a good rational decision. We can debate whether that's a good rational decision. It's certainly a bad decision from the point of impact on people, impact on the organization, the ability to get to your goals, essentially, long term with an organization. In the case of the Hebrews, the case of Judah, for example, it's just that. They're playing off Egypt with the Babylonians, got them destroyed and utterly destroyed them. And they were, for three quarters, over 50 years, almost three quarters of a century, where they were in utter desolation. It took them hundreds of years to recover. It was a bad decision. They made a series of bad decisions. Why? They didn't listen to their hearts, as we would call them. So there is a desire. I mentioned Desiring God. Desiring God is John Piper's organization. It's a website. Um, like other biblical studies things, when you Google things about the Bible, you have to really watch it, because the top searches in your list and that new AI generator there are going to be content that organizations, parachurch organizations, have paid millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in aggregate of dollars to make sure that they're in the top of your list. There's a lot of money in evangelical Christianity, tons of money. And this is where a lot of it goes, is to influence people. Desiring God is one of those organizations. They pay to get in the top of your search list. Uh, and they wrote an article, the co-founder with Piper, he wrote an article called, that was just a couple years old, says, um, don't trust your heart. Don't follow your heart. That was the name of the article. Don't follow your heart. And they said, no, our hearts will not save us. We need to be saved from our hearts, is a direct quote of that. And it's because Jeremiah 17:9 tells us the true nature of the heart, and that is that it's devious, it's perverse, and it can't be trusted. And these are pretty smart people. They aren't idiots, and they know Hebrew, so they know what they're doing, right? Whether they're malicious about it or not, I can't tell what their motives are, but they're definitely pushing this Calvinist idea that you're so depraved, you cannot trust your feelings, you cannot trust anything about you. You need to bow down to an authoritarian God that controls every molecule in the universe. That's their thinking, right? Instead of saying that God's giving good advice here, of saying you can't be only in your head. You can't only do cruel or a cool calculation. Know that you have to do good decision making and be faithful to me. And what does being faithful to God mean? Well, in in the sense that Jeremiah is talking about, is to be consistent and faithful and putting God first in decisions. And putting God in first in decisions for most of us who aren't these sort of hardcore Calvinists is to consult our heart, is to be compassionate, to be caring above all. And that whenever we make a decision, we think of the entire impact of that decision. And that's what being a good, faithful follower of Jesus means in our world, or to in the Jewish world, it's being faithful to God, is to apply. It's not just follow the law, but it's to apply the law with mercy and grace. That's very much in Jewish tradition as well. So this is, I think, it's just so crucial, because the desiring God type people are also the same people that will tell you that it's a sin to be empathetic, and that justice is more important than empathy, or that mercy only goes so far. But as soon as it's anything to do with sin or, faithlessness, or those people who've fallen away, they need justice, because God's wrath needs to be satisfied. And it's such a punitive, negative way, and it's not scriptural. You have to take certain verses, especially Romans 3. You have to, from Romans 3, which is a lot of where a lot of this comes from, but you also have to cherry pick Old Testament passages like this one right here. Or you have to say, well, God was the warrior God, and look at all the cruel things he did in the Old Testament. But if you look under the covers a little bit, and you understand Hebrew a little bit, and especially when you look at Jeremiah, Jeremiah is saying the opposite of what these people are saying. Jeremiah is saying, don't provoke the enemy. Don't just think with your head. Don't do the political calculations. Think with your heart. Be compassionate. Be faithful to the Lord. And I'll talk more about Jeremiah, because there is just so much here. To me, it's the Old Testament book that's probably cherry picked the most without understanding, because it's really a messy book that has lots of different themes, and it's kind of disjointed in a way. It also talks about a very trying time in Israelite history just before the exile. So it's really important to look at Jeremiah and realize it's filled with compassion. It's filled with faithfulness to God. So with that, I'll say people say lots of things, especially about heart, kidneys, bad theology, and empathy that aren't in the Bible. And you just really have to look at it in a way that's a lot less punitive and a lot and with some understanding. And with that, I say, God bless you.